Japan has officially scrapped its old COVID policies, and with it, is finally introducing a new normal in Japan for both tourists and residents alike. And with the old COVID policy gone, it seems like people are finally getting more and more comfortable with ditching their masks for good. Not only is the mask situation improving, but Japan's tourism also continues to show healthy signs of recovery, with 95% of Japan's cities reporting bigger crowds and almost 2 million visitors in April as China's residents begin to travel again. So today we're going to cover what Japan looks like now that both the COVID policies and mask requirements are gone, what we can expect as tourism passes the 2 million monthly mark and China makes its big return, and what this means for you and all your future trips to Japan. Starting off with the most important topic of this video, we have the government officially scrapping the last of its COVID policies. On May 8th, the government officially downgraded COVID to the same severity as the flu. This means more hospitals are now able to treat COVID patients, governments can no longer declare state of emergencies due to COVID, and thus businesses can no longer be forced to close. Along with downgraded COVID severity status, the government also scrapped all COVID-related entry requirements. This is all great news because now there is no longer a risk of your trip being ruined due to COVID closures, which used to be a common occurrence only a year ago. But with all these great changes, I'm sure you're beginning to ask, Alex, what is Japan looking like now that all these requirements are gone? And what does the mask situation look like? Should I be bringing a ton of masks on my next trip? Well, don't you worry, because for the past 2 weeks, I've been closely observing the public's reaction to the recently scrapped policies. And here's what I've noticed. To no real surprise, the majority of Japan continues to wear masks while commuting on the train, on official business, and during working hours in general. And that's a little understandable, because after 3 solid years, it's gonna take the public just a little bit longer to feel comfortable about finally ditching those masks, at least during working hours. But even during business hours, I've begun to see more and more people ditch their masks for good. Back in March, when the mask requirement first lifted, about 5% of the commuters I observed had their mask off. But now, fast forward to May, I have seen that number double, with more than 10 to 20% of the train with their mask off. But like I said, that's only during business hours, as the nightlife in Japan tells a completely different story. The past 2 weeks, I have gone out quite a bit and noticed even less people wearing their masks after hours. And that's pretty understandable, because if you're going out at night to party, then getting sick probably isn't your highest concern. But in all seriousness, it really does seem like the majority of people only wear masks during working hours. Then, once work is over, they hang their masks up and go out to have a good time. And with it being only 2 weeks since the COVID policies dropped, I can anticipate that more people will be taking off their masks not only at night, but during the day as well. With all that being said, if you are currently in Japan or plan on traveling here soon, I wouldn't be too worried about wearing a mask everywhere you go. In fact, the only place I would even think of wearing a mask anymore is on public transportation, and only if it's really crowded. Overall, the mask situation in Japan is changing quicker than anyone would have thought, and I will let you know when I see more major changes or updates. Masks aren't the only thing reflecting Japan's new way of life, as tourism, both domestic and abroad, is making a strong comeback. Japan's domestic tourism is back in full force, with over 95% of major cities reporting a large increase in crowds over the Golden Week holiday. And this is great news because it shows the public is not only becoming more comfortable with dropping the masks, but they are becoming more comfortable being in large crowds and enjoying life without masks once again. And I think this is only the beginning. Once summer rolls around and it starts getting pretty hot over here, I wouldn't be surprised if I saw more masks getting ditched even in large crowds. And while domestic tourism is going strong, we can't forget about the surge in tourists we are also seeing from abroad. The tourist numbers are out for April, and reports show Japan had almost 2 million visitors last month, which is 66% of Japan's peak tourists before the pandemic. While the trend is continuing to climb back to pre-pandemic levels like previous months, there are 2 interesting points to note this time. China's considerable jump in tourism, and tourists spending on average much more than before the pandemic. Starting with the jump in tourist spending, tourists have been reportedly buying much more than before the pandemic. In fact, Japan's tourism agency has reported a 30% jump in spending compared to pre-pandemic numbers, and tourists are on track to spend more this year than Japan's busiest tourist year. That's pretty impressive, especially when you consider that Japan is only at 66% of its peak tourism numbers. Out of all the visitors from different countries, the highest spenders came from Australia, France, and China, which is interesting to note because that last country is about to become a lot more relevant in the coming months. Ever since China dropped its zero COVID policy, there has been a considerable influx of Chinese tourists entering Japan. In February, only 36,000 Chinese tourists paid Japan a visit, but in April that number almost tripled, with 108,000 tourists from China visiting Japan. And as I have said in previous videos, as China continues to open up, we can expect to see this number quickly climb back up and push Japan's tourist numbers back to pre-pandemic levels sooner rather than later. The only factor that might delay this jump a little bit are the amount of flights between China and Japan, which is still on the road to a full recovery. So now that we've covered the majority of Japan's recent tourism news, let's go over what all of this means for you. With all these recent changes and updates, here's what you can expect if you're visiting Japan in the near future. Be sure to plan your trip out and book things well in advance. You don't necessarily have to plan your trip down to the minute, but having a good idea of where you want to travel and knowing whether it'll require an advanced booking or not will make your trip go much more smoothly. This also includes booking hotels well in advance. Recently, hotels have been jumping in price, and with hotel staff shortages still being a problem, you can expect prices to stay a little high for the foreseeable future. Also, with the mask situation continuing to improve, you'll only really need to bring a couple of masks on your trip. Restaurants will hardly ask you to wear your mask anymore, if at all, and people hardly wear them when they go out for the night. The only place I would say you would consider wearing a mask is on a train, and that's only if it's really crowded. And finally, prepare to have fun. With all these policies finally gone, Japan is slowly returning to its former glory and will be sure to give you an experience you will never forget. Like this video if you found it useful, subscribe for more content about all things Japan, and check out the affiliate links in the description below when you plan your next trip to Japan. Alright, that's gonna do it, and until then, I'll see you next time.